Everyone laughed when the widow bought an abandoned bridge for pennies, but as soon as she lifted a few boards, the truth, hidden for decades, silenced everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write where you are watching this video from. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and when the morning finally broke, it did so with a thin mist rising off the wide river that cut through the county. The mist clung to the old wooden bridge like a ghost refusing to leave. From the road leading into town, the bridge was a looming shape, its skeletal beams blackened with rot and time, its once proud trusses bowed with age. Most people avoided looking at it altogether, dismissing it as an eyesore, or worse, as the cursed remnant of something that should have collapsed long ago. But for Elizabeth Hayes, it was impossible to look away. She stood in the doorway of her small rented house, a thin coat wrapped around her shoulders, staring down at the folded newspaper in her hand. The print was smudged from the damp, but the notice was still clear enough to read. The county was offering leases on unused properties, desperate to rid itself of liabilities that no one wanted. And there, beneath the listing for abandoned lots and old barns, was the one that made her pulse quicken. North River Bridge, wooden suspension, closed to traffic in 1972, property deemed unsafe, available for lease. It was absurd, almost laughable. Who would want an unsafe bridge, left to rot for half a century? And yet Elizabeth felt something stir inside her, something restless and reckless that had been absent for years. Her neighbors would not understand. They already called her eccentric, the widow who still spoke softly to her late husband in the quiet of her kitchen, who walked alone at dusk with a look in her eyes that unsettled them. Since Robert's death, she had drifted through her days, half present, half lost. The children had moved away long ago. Her son worked in the city 3 hours north. Her daughter taught school in another state. They called when they could, visited when duty compelled them, but their lives were busy and full, and Elizabeth's had shrunk into silence. The bridge notice felt, impossibly, like an invitation. When she mentioned it in the grocery store a week later, the reaction was immediate. A woman by the apples laughed aloud, nearly dropping her bag. "That bridge? Lord, Liz, you've truly gone mad. People vanish there. Don't you remember?" Another, leaning over her cart, nodded with a smirk. "My father used to say the bridge swallowed souls. They closed it because too many people didn't come back." The laughter was sharp, unkind, and Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn. She said nothing, only adjusted the basket on her arm and moved on. But their words lodged like burrs under her skin, prickling with every step. That night she sat at her kitchen table, the newspaper spread out beside the stack of bills she could barely pay. She traced the faded photograph of the bridge with her fingertip, imagining it not as it was now, but as it could be. A tourist stop, a lookout. A place people might actually pay to visit if it were cleaned and made safe again. The idea was foolish, she knew. She had neither the money nor the strength for such an undertaking. And yet she also knew that her life, as it stood, had dwindled to almost nothing. Routine and loneliness filled her days like dust in an empty house. To risk what little she had seemed madness, but to risk nothing at all was worse. She dreamed of Robert that night. He stood on the bridge, his hand outstretched, smiling the way he used to when he was proud of her. She woke with tears on her face, the dream clinging like the mist on the river. By morning, the decision had taken root. She would lease the bridge. The county clerk barely looked at her when she signed the papers. His eyebrows rose when she explained her plan, but he asked no questions, only stamped the documents with finality. "It's yours, Mrs. Hayes," he said, as if granting her a burden rather than an opportunity, "though I can't imagine what you'll do with it." She only nodded, clutching the keys as though they were talismans. The first time she drove out to the bridge as its legal custodian, the sky was pale and cold, the river swollen from recent rains. The road narrowed as it approached, winding between skeletal trees that seemed to bow toward the water. And then the bridge came into view. Enormous, weathered, leaning into its own reflection, it stretched across the river like a wounded giant. Elizabeth parked at the edge of the gravel approach and stepped out, her boots sinking slightly in the wet earth. She paused at the threshold where the wooden boards began. The air smelled of rot and riverweed, and the wind pushed at her coat as though urging her back. She laid her hand on the railing, and the wood was damp and rough beneath her palm. The first step sent a groan echoing through the planks, as though the bridge itself protested her intrusion. Another step, then another. She moved slowly, listening to the creak of the beams, the rush of the water below, the whisper of wind through the broken latticework. Halfway across, she stopped, looking down at the river. The water churned and frothed, a restless gray expanse that seemed to carry whispers in its current. She could almost believe the stories then, of souls swallowed whole. Yet there was also something magnificent about it, a defiance in the way the bridge still stood after all these years of neglect. It had been mocked, condemned, abandoned, and yet it endured, much like herself. By the time she reached the far side, her fear had softened into something else, something like belonging. She turned back, gazing at the span stretching behind her. It was dangerous, yes, and broken, but it was hers. In the following weeks, the gossip in town grew louder. Men at the diner shook their heads, declaring she would be bankrupt within months. Women at church whispered behind their hymnals, pitying the poor widow chasing nonsense. Elizabeth pretended not to hear, though the words weighed on her. At night, in the solitude of her house, she questioned herself endlessly. But each morning she returned to the bridge, and each morning she found herself drawn further into its silent strength. It was on one of those mornings, as she stood gazing at the beams silhouetted against the rising sun, that she realized she had already crossed a threshold. The life she had known, quiet, safe, suffocating, was behind her. Before her lay something uncertain, something fraught with danger and doubt, but also alive. She tightened her coat against the wind, her heart beating with both fear and resolve. Whatever secrets the bridge held, whatever past it carried, she would face them. The creak of the boards under her feet seemed almost like a reply as she turned and walked back across, the river roaring below. The beginning had come, and there would be no turning back. The days after Elizabeth signed the lease blurred into a rhythm of preparation. At first she thought she could take the work on herself, but standing at the edge of the bridge with its vast stretch of weathered boards and bowing timbers, she realized how foolish that was. Her hands, though steady, were not the hands of a builder. Her back ached after carrying firewood, and her knees stiffened with the chill of damp mornings. No, she would need help, however reluctant she was to admit it. She placed an advertisement on the bulletin board at the diner and another at the hardware store, and within a week 2 men had come forward, willing to offer their labor for modest pay. Their names were Paul and Rick, both locals who had grown up hearing the same stories of the cursed bridge. When they first met her at the site, their expressions were skeptical, bordering on amused. Paul, tall and broad with a gray beard, squinted at the beams as if already calculating how long before they collapsed. Rick, younger and wiry, leaned against the railing with his arms crossed, a smirk playing at his mouth. "You sure about this, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked. "This old beast's been rotting since my daddy was a boy. Folks say it's hungrier than the river itself." Elizabeth only nodded, unwilling to rise to the bait. They began work in late March, when the mornings were still cold, but the afternoons held the promise of spring. The first task was clearing debris, broken branches, piles of leaves, and shards of timber scattered across the boards. The men pried loose planks that had warped beyond repair, tossing them into the river where they floated away like wounded birds. Elizabeth worked alongside them as best she could, sweeping the boards clear, gathering nails into an old tin, her breath rising in small clouds. The air was filled with the sounds of hammering and sawing, mingling with the constant roar of the river below. It was grueling work, and yet there was a strange exhilaration in it. Each board removed, each rusted bolt replaced, felt like peeling back layers of decay. The bridge, though groaning and stubborn, seemed to yield slowly under their persistence, as if recognizing the effort to restore it. Elizabeth felt her spirits lift in ways she had not expected. At night she returned home bone-tired, her arms sore and her clothes reeking of sawdust and river water. But she slept with a depth she had not known in years. Still, the bridge carried an unease that even labor could not dispel. The wind that rushed through its beams seemed to carry whispers, rising and falling with the current. More than once, Elizabeth caught herself glancing over her shoulder, certain she had heard footsteps that were not her own. When she mentioned this to Paul, he laughed and said it was only the echo of the boards. But his eyes darted quickly toward the far end of the span, and she wondered if he truly believed his own words. One afternoon, as they paused for lunch, an old man appeared at the far end of the bridge. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane, his shoulders hunched beneath a threadbare coat. Elizabeth watched as he shuffled toward them, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the bridge itself. When he reached them, he stopped and rested against the railing, breathing heavily. His face was weathered like old parchment, and his eyes, though cloudy, held a sharpness that unsettled her. "You're the one who leased it," he said, his voice rough as gravel. It was not a question. Elizabeth nodded. The old man tapped his cane against the boards, listening to the hollow sound. "I knew this bridge when it was alive, guarded it even, but that was long before it soured." Elizabeth frowned. "Soured?" He turned his gaze on her then, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny. Bridges are meant to carry people safely from one side to the other. This one carried too much, and it never let go. People disappeared. Whole wagons once, though no one cared to tell it plain. Best thing they ever did was close it. You'd do well to leave it closed. Paul chuckled uneasily, but the sound fell flat in the silence that followed. Elizabeth forced a smile and thanked the man for his concern, though her chest tightened with unease. The old man shook his head and began the slow walk back across, muttering words she could not catch. The sound of his cane striking the boards lingered long after he was gone. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the river burned with the reflection of fire, Elizabeth lingered on the bridge alone. She ran her fingers along the railing, tracing grooves worn by decades of hands. The warning of the old man echoed in her mind, yet instead of discouraging her, it deepened her resolve. Whatever had happened here, whatever stories were buried in the beams, she would uncover them. Work continued, though not without incident. A week later, Rick lifted a section of boards near the center span and called Elizabeth over. Beneath the planks lay a patch of newer wood, awkwardly nailed over what looked like an access hatch. The nails were rusted, but clearly not as old as the rest of the bridge. Someone had gone to the trouble of sealing it off long after the bridge had closed. "Strange," Rick muttered, prying at one of the boards. "Almost like somebody didn't want anyone poking around down there." He gave a sharp tug, and the board groaned but held. Elizabeth felt a shiver run through her as she looked at the patch, an inexplicable sense of intrusion prickling at her skin. She told Rick to leave it for now, that they had other work to finish. He shrugged, though his expression betrayed curiosity. That night, Elizabeth lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The image of the patched boards would not leave her. Why seal off part of a bridge that no longer carried traffic? What could be beneath it that needed hiding? She told herself she would find out in time, but sleep came only in restless bursts, filled with dreams of hollow spaces and muffled cries carried on the wind. The days grew longer, and with them the bridge began to show signs of revival. Fresh boards gleamed pale against the weathered gray. Bolts tightened, railings straightened. Yet for every piece renewed, there seemed another waiting to reveal its decay. It was as if the structure resisted, testing her determination. The men joked that it was cursed labor, that the bridge was alive and unwilling to be mended. Elizabeth laughed with them, but in her heart she wondered if they were right. One morning she arrived early, the mist still clinging to the water. Standing in the silence, she thought she heard a voice carried faintly on the breeze, low and indistinct. She froze, straining to listen, but only the river answered. Shaking her head, she forced herself to begin sweeping the boards. Yet as she worked, she could not shake the feeling that the bridge was watching, waiting. When Paul and Rick arrived, she did not mention it. She had learned already that speaking her fears only gave them more power. Instead, she focused on the work, hammering, tightening, sawing, her movements steady even as her mind wandered to the sealed section of planks. It was clear to her now that the bridge held secrets. The old man's warning, the patched boards, the unease in her chest, they were not coincidence. Something lay beneath the wood, something that time and neglect had not erased. As she paused at the center span, gazing down at the restless current below. She knew that her journey with the bridge had only begun, and whatever waited in its hidden spaces, she would find it. The sun broke through the clouds then, casting the river in brilliant silver. Elizabeth tightened her grip on the railing, her reflection wavering in the water below. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt alive with purpose, even if that purpose was tangled in shadows she could not yet see. She turned back to the work as the men called for her, but her thoughts remained fixed on the sealed boards and the darkness they concealed. It was only a matter of time before she would pry them open, and when she did, the bridge would finally begin to speak. The weeks of labor had left the bridge looking less like a carcass and more like the skeleton of something being reborn, though its progress was slow and stubborn. Elizabeth found herself caught between pride and unease each morning as she approached it. The fresh boards gleamed against the weathered structure like new scars, but they did little to change the sense of secrecy that clung to the place. The sealed section near the center span lingered at the edge of her mind, calling to her in restless moments when she paused from sweeping or hauling tools. She told herself it could wait, that she and the men had to finish what was practical first, but she knew she would not be able to leave it untouched forever. It was late one afternoon, the kind of day when the sky sagged low with clouds and the air carried a damp chill, when the bridge revealed something that could no longer be ignored. They had been replacing a run of warped planks along the north edge when Rick struck one with his hammer, and it gave way with a sound like a groan. The board snapped under his weight, sending him stumbling forward with a startled curse. Elizabeth's heart leapt into her throat as he flailed, one boot dangling dangerously above the water far below. But Paul lunged and caught his arm, yanking him back to safety. "Damn thing nearly dropped me into the river," Rick muttered, his face pale beneath the smear of dirt on his cheek. He spat over the edge and kicked the remains of the board aside. Beneath the gap, Elizabeth saw something glint dully in the shadows. At first she thought it was just more metal bolts catching the weak light, but the shape was wrong. It was too deliberate, too square. Paul noticed it too. "What the hell is that?" he asked, leaning down with a frown. His big hands pried at the surrounding boards, and with effort he cleared enough space for them to see. Wedged into the cavity beneath the span was a metal box, long and narrow, its surface mottled with rust and streaked black from years of damp. Chains wrapped it tight, their links fused with corrosion. It looked as though it had been there for decades, sealed away like something never meant to be found. Rick whistled low. "Now that's not part of the bridge." He squatted, peering at it with narrowed eyes. "Looks like somebody didn't want anyone getting inside." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. She crouched beside it, her fingers brushing the cold iron. The surface flaked beneath her touch, leaving red dust on her skin. Her imagination raced treasure, perhaps, or evidence of something darker. She tried to still her thoughts, but she could not. Whatever lay inside, someone had gone to great trouble to conceal it. Paul fetched a crowbar from the tool chest, muttering that if the box was hiding rot or danger, they had better know sooner than later. Together, the men pried it loose from its resting place. It came free with a shriek of protest, the chains scraping against the wood. It was heavier than it looked, and the three of them strained to haul it up onto the boards. Elizabeth's arms trembled from the effort, but she did not let go until the box lay before them, thudding onto the planks with finality. The lock was a twisted lump of rust, useless after so many years. Rick swung the crowbar with a grunt, and the chain snapped apart. The lid gave way reluctantly, screeching on corroded hinges, and the stench of damp, rotting paper wafted out. Elizabeth leaned back instinctively, covering her nose, but her eyes remained fixed on the contents. Inside lay stacks of newspapers, folded brittle with age, letters tied in fraying string, and a leather-bound folder swollen from moisture. The air around them seemed to tighten, as though the bridge itself had exhaled a secret long held. Rick reached in first, lifting one of the newspapers. The date at the top read July 1965. The headline spoke of a summer fair in town, but scrawled in the margin in dark ink were words that made Elizabeth's blood run cold. 3 gone this week. Rick looked at her sharply, then back at the page. "What the hell does that mean?" he asked, his voice low. Elizabeth's hand trembled as she picked up a letter. The paper was soft with age, nearly disintegrating at the folds. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. She read the words aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Midnight on the bridge. The deal cannot wait. Do not speak of this." She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. More letters spoke of exchanges, of wagons meeting in the dark, of money owed. One bore a crude drawing of the very bridge they stood on, a circle scrawled over the center span. The folder yielded more, reports from engineers, though not the usual kind. These spoke of structural weaknesses, but also of alterations planks reinforced in odd places, hidden compartments in the beams. The tone of the writing was cautious, as though the engineer himself feared what he was recording. At the bottom of one page was a single line that seemed to leap at Elizabeth's eyes. "This bridge has been used for purposes beyond passage. It is a vault, a hiding place." Paul muttered a curse and crossed himself. "I don't like this. Not one bit." He shoved the folder back into the box and stood, his face pale. "This isn't our business, Liz. Whatever's in here, it was meant to stay buried." But Elizabeth could not look away. Her fingers lingered on the brittle paper, tracing words that spoke of shadows and secrecy. The townsfolk had always whispered about disappearances, about the bridge swallowing people. She had thought them nothing more than rural myths, the kind of stories that grew from fear and imagination. Yet here lay evidence, hard and undeniable, that something sinister had indeed taken place. She felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration, her heart hammering in her chest. She had uncovered a piece of truth that others had tried to erase. Rick gave a nervous laugh. "Maybe it's just old gossip. Folks back then loved their ghost stories." But his voice lacked conviction, and when Elizabeth met his eyes, she saw the same unease that churned in her own chest. They repacked the box hastily, though Elizabeth kept a few letters tucked into her coat pocket when the men weren't looking. She told them she wanted to examine the papers more closely at home. Paul shook his head, muttering that she was inviting trouble, while Rick made a joke about curses, though his laugh was hollow. Both insisted they wanted nothing more to do with it. By the time the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the river, they had gathered their tools and departed, leaving Elizabeth alone with the box and the echo of their footsteps fading into silence. She stood at the center of the bridge, the rusted container at her feet, and felt the weight of the discovery settle over her. The sky was streaked with bruised clouds, and the river below churned with restless energy. She clutched the letters inside her coat, her breath shallow. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt a pulse of purpose, sharp and urgent. This bridge was not merely a structure to be repaired. It was a keeper of secrets, a witness to events long hidden. And now she was its custodian. That night, back in her small kitchen, Elizabeth spread the papers across the table. The lamp cast a pool of yellow light over the fragile documents. Her hands shook as she turned the pages, deciphering scrawled notes and fragmented records. Again and again, she saw hints of transactions conducted in the dark. Names abbreviated with initials, places marked with circles on crude maps. One note chilled her more than the rest. "Do not trust the sheriff. He knows, and he is bound to them." She sat back, her heart thudding. The sheriff. If even lawmen had been entwined in whatever had happened here, then the bridge was more than cursed folklore. It was a crime scene, its boards heavy with the weight of silenced voices. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. Fear coiled in her stomach, but alongside it burned a fragile flame of resolve. For years she had drifted, purposeless and small. Now the bridge had handed her something undeniable, something that demanded she bear witness. The night stretched on as she read, the ticking of the clock the only sound. She did not notice the darkness pressing against the windows, nor the way the wind rattled the panes as though trying to gain entry. She was lost in the words of the dead, in the echoes of transactions whispered decades before. When at last she rose and gathered the papers into a neat pile, she felt changed. She had stepped onto a path from which there was no return. Outside, the river whispered as it flowed beneath the bridge. The wind carried its murmur through the night, and Elizabeth, standing at her window, whispered back as though answering a summons. The bridge had spoken, and she had heard. Whatever shadows lingered there, she would not turn away. She was already too deep, and the truth, whatever it was, had claimed her. The discovery of the metal box lingered in Elizabeth's thoughts like a dream half remembered, too vivid to dismiss yet too strange to fully believe. In the days that followed, she carried the letters and newspapers with her, as if they were fragile relics. The workers had made their position clear. They wanted nothing more to do with the bridge now that its secrets had bled into the open. Paul avoided her calls, and Rick sent a short message that he was taking work elsewhere. Their departure left Elizabeth alone on the span of wood and iron, but she felt no desire to plead for their return. A strange determination had taken root inside her. The bridge was hers, and so too were the burdens it carried. One evening, after a long day spent sweeping debris from the boards, Elizabeth returned home with a bundle of papers tucked carefully into a satchel. The house was quiet, as it always was. The ticking clock in the kitchen sounded unnaturally loud, marking time in a way that made her feel suspended between past and present. She set the satchel on the table, lit the lamp, and began to sort through the documents once more. The brittle pages crumbled at the edges under her touch, the ink blurred in places by water stains. But the urgency of the words remained. It was then she noticed something she had overlooked before. Tucked at the bottom beneath a stack of letters, a small book bound in leather, warped with damp and nearly black with age. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it free. She had missed it in the half-light of the bridge, but here under the steady glow of the lamp she saw it clearly. A diary, its cover cracked, its pages swollen and uneven. On the inside cover, written in a careful hand, was a name she recognized from whispered legends of the town: Sheriff Arthur Blackwell. Dated 1962. Elizabeth sat back, the weight of it heavy in her lap. For a long time she simply stared at the name. The man had been sheriff when the bridge was closed, a figure wrapped in both authority and suspicion. She had grown up hearing old men mutter his name when the subject of the bridge arose, though always with a glance over the shoulder, as though afraid the dead might still listen. To hold his diary now felt like trespassing into a chamber no one was ever meant to enter. She opened the book with care, and the scent of mold and dust rose to meet her. The first pages were ordinary enough accounts of arrests, mentions of disputes in town, notes on weather and patrols. But as she turned further, the tone shifted. The writing grew tighter, more hurried, as though the man himself had written in haste, aware that what he set down might cost him his life. Elizabeth read for hours, her heart hammering as the words painted a picture darker than any rumor she had ever heard. The sheriff wrote of meetings held on the bridge at night, wagons arriving under the cover of darkness, men carrying crates too heavy to be grain or tools. He wrote of voices raised in anger, of exchanges made in whispers, of names too powerful to be spoken aloud. He did not write them plainly but reduced them to initials. 3 letters repeated again and again, a cipher that hinted at men of influence, perhaps even those who had governed the county itself. One passage in particular made her skin prickle. Another body pulled from the river today. The coroner says accident, but I saw the rope marks. They think me blind, but I am not. If I speak, they will silence me as they have others. Already I feel their eyes upon me. Elizabeth laid the diary flat on the table and pressed her hand against her mouth, struggling to steady her breath. It was not just gossip then, not just fearful tales passed down. The sheriff himself had borne witness. Page after page revealed his growing desperation. He had tried to record enough to preserve the truth without revealing too much that could incriminate him directly. He wrote of how the bridge had been altered, of compartments built into its beams, of spaces used to conceal ledgers and money. And always, he circled back to the disappearances, the men and women who never came home, whose families whispered of them, until the whispers faded into silence. Toward the end of the book, the entries grew shorter, fractured by fear. They know I am not with them. Last night I heard footsteps behind me, though the street was empty. If anything happens, this book is proof. To whoever finds it, beware. Trust no one. The final line was scrawled, jagged, ink-splattered as if written with a trembling hand. They are coming. Elizabeth closed the diary, her hands clammy. The lamp flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to lean closer, as though they too were reading over her shoulder. She sat in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint groan of pipes in the walls. Outside, the wind pressed against the house, rattling the shutters like restless fingers. She had wanted purpose, but the enormity of what lay before her now threatened to crush her. The bridge was not merely cursed, it was a monument to crimes committed in secret, to lives stolen in silence. Yet along with her fear came a surge of resolve. She could not look away. She had stumbled upon the truth, and to bury it again would be a betrayal not only of those who had vanished, but of herself. For too long she had lived in the shadow of grief, her days small and her nights empty. The bridge had given her something she had not expected, a reason to endure. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay in bed with the diary on the nightstand, the words of the dead sheriff echoing in her mind. Every creak of the house seemed magnified, every whisper of the wind like a voice calling her name. Once she sat bolt upright, certain she had heard footsteps on the porch, but when she peered through the curtain, the yard lay still beneath the moonlight. She returned to bed, though her heart did not slow for hours. The following morning she returned to the bridge with the diary tucked inside her coat. The river roared beneath her, carrying away the remnants of winter, but she heard only the sheriff's voice in her head. She paused at the center span, laying her hand against the patched section of boards that had haunted her since the day they found it. The sun glinted off the water, but the space beneath the woods seemed darker than ever, as though it concealed more than mere shadows. She knew now that the bridge had been altered for a reason, that its very bones were complicit in the deeds it had hidden. She spent hours pacing the boards, tracing the structure with her eyes, looking for signs of what the sheriff had described. Her fingers brushed over nails driven in at strange angles, boards newer than their neighbors, spaces that seemed to echo hollowly when she tapped them. The bridge was a riddle, and she had only begun to decipher its language. That evening, back at her house, she copied passages from the diary into a notebook, fearful that the fragile pages might disintegrate before she understood their meaning. As she wrote, she found herself whispering aloud, as though speaking the words gave them weight. This bridge has been used for purposes beyond passage. It is a vault, a hiding place. She repeated the sentence again and again until it felt carved into her bones. She considered telling someone, her daughter perhaps, or her son, but the sheriff's warning echoed too loudly. Trust no one. The town had buried this truth once before, and she could not be certain whose hands still clutched the threads of that old power. Instead, she hid the diary beneath a loose board in her bedroom floor, the same place she had once hidden spare money during the hardest months after Robert's death. It seemed fitting that one secret should shelter another. As she lowered herself onto the bed, the diary's absence from her sight did not lessen its hold on her. She closed her eyes and the words scrawled in the sheriff's hand burned behind her lids. They are coming. She wondered if he had written that the night before he vanished, and whether he had felt the same weight pressing on his chest that she felt now. Sleep came late, troubled and shallow. She dreamed of footsteps on the bridge, of voices carried on the river, of shadows leaning from the beams with outstretched hands. When she woke, her sheets were damp with sweat, and the dawn light carried no comfort. The bridge was calling her back, insistent and unyielding. And she knew she would go, for the truth could not be left in silence any longer. The sheriff's diary had torn away the veil of rumor and left her staring into the abyss of fact. The bridge was not just a monument to time and decay, it was a mausoleum of secrets, its planks heavy with blood and betrayal. Elizabeth pressed her palm against the cool window pane, watching the river shimmer in the distance. Whatever had happened there, whatever forces had silenced the sheriff, still lingered in the marrow of the structure, and now by fate or chance, it had become her inheritance. The diary stayed hidden beneath the floorboard of Elizabeth's bedroom, but its words never left her. She could not sweep the kitchen without hearing Arthur Blackwell's frantic scrawl whispering in her mind, could not walk across the bridge without imagining his tired eyes watching from the shadows of another decade. The bridge had stopped being just an undertaking of wood and nails. It had become a weight pressing on her chest, a vessel of unfinished stories demanding to be told. Yet with that knowledge came something else, something she had not expected but felt with growing certainty. The past was not as distant as it seemed. At first, the unease was subtle, easy to dismiss as nerves. A hammer misplaced, lying in a spot where she was certain she had not left it. A coil of rope unspooled across the boards when she returned from a break. Paul and Rick were long gone, their absence leaving her with no convenient scapegoats for the small disturbances. She told herself it was her own forgetfulness, her hands clumsy with fatigue, her memory not as sharp as it had once been. But denial wore thin quickly, especially when the patterns repeated. One morning she arrived early, the mist still draped low over the water, and found the center span not as she had left it. A line of fresh nails gleamed silver where rusted ones had been, though she had not replaced them. The section of patched boards, the one that had haunted her from the first days, gaped ever so slightly at one corner, as though someone had pried at it during the night. Elizabeth dropped her satchel and knelt, her breath fogging in the cool air. The wood fibers were splintered, raw and pale, too fresh to be decades old. Someone had been here. She stood quickly, scanning the far bank. The fog blurred the trees into smudges of gray, but she could not shake the feeling of eyes lingering just beyond sight. Her heart pounded, and she told herself it was imagination, the lingering paranoia seated by the sheriff's words. Yet she could not dismiss the unease that followed her the rest of the day, nor the way she caught herself glancing back over her shoulder with every step. The proof arrived 2 evenings later, though it came in the simplest of forms. Returning home from town, she climbed her porch steps and stopped short. A slip of paper lay pinned beneath a stone in front of her door. She bent and lifted it, her hands trembling as she unfolded the scrap. The message was written in chalk, the words jagged and hurried. "Leave the bridge in peace." Her knees weakened, and she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. For a long time she stood there, staring at the crude letters, her pulse loud in her ears. Someone knew. Someone had seen her poring over the bridge, hauling away the metal box, carrying papers home under her coat. The warning was not a relic of history, but a hand reaching from the present, sharp and alive. She wanted to crumple the note, to cast it into the wind, but instead she tucked it into her coat pocket. Evidence, she told herself, though the word tasted bitter. That night she could not eat. She paced the kitchen, the shadows stretching long across the floor, every creak of the house magnified until it sounded like a footstep. When the wind rattled the window panes, she nearly dropped the teacup in her hand. Twice she went to the door, flinging it open, only to find the yard empty beneath the cold stars. She locked the door again, bolted the windows, drew the curtains tight. Yet safety eluded her, for safety was no longer possible once the silence had been broken. The following morning she returned to the bridge, though dread clung to her with every step. The boards groaned beneath her feet, the river roared its endless song, but over it all she felt the weight of the message burning in her pocket. She worked quickly, avoiding the center span, sweeping debris from the edges and tightening bolts at the railings. Yet her eyes kept drifting back to the patched section, to the space the sheriff had called a vault. She knew now that she was not the only one who feared what lay inside. Whoever had left the note wanted her gone, wanted the bridge left in silence, and that alone was reason enough to continue. That afternoon she made a choice she had long resisted. She descended the sloping embankment to the underside of the bridge, where the beams stretched like ribs across the water. The descent was slow, her boots slipping on loose soil, her breath ragged with effort. Beneath the bridge the world felt muted, the roar of the river muffled to a low growl, the boards above groaning faintly as they shifted in the breeze. She moved carefully, her hand brushing across beams slick with moss, until she found what she sought. There, wedged into the massive timber at the center, was a hollow space. At first glance it looked like little more than rot, but when she leaned closer, she saw the deliberate shaping of the cavity, the boards nailed at odd angles to form a niche. With trembling fingers, she pried at the wood, her nails catching splinters, until a small bundle fell free. It landed with a dull thud, wrapped in cracked leather. Elizabeth crouched, her hands shaking as she unwrapped the covering. Inside were papers, folded and yellowed, bound with twine. She sat back on her heels, the damp earth cold beneath her, and unfolded the first sheet. It was a record of transactions, numbers written in neat columns, sums that grew impossibly large. At the bottom was a signature reduced to initials, the same three that had appeared again and again in the sheriff's diary. Another page listed names, half of them familiar as surnames still carried by families in town. The rest she did not recognize. Her breath quickened as she read further. These were not the idle scribbles of rumor, but records, precise and damning. They spoke of bribes, of shipments disguised as farm goods, of exchanges that stretched far beyond the town's borders. Elizabeth's stomach turned. This was not a bridge cursed by bad luck. It was a bridge built into a system of corruption, its timbers heavy with the weight of greed and blood. She clutched the bundle to her chest and made her way back up the embankment, her legs trembling. When she emerged onto the bridge again, the light had shifted. The fog had burned away, leaving the sky pale and thin, but she felt no relief. She had proof now, but proof carried danger. The sheriff's warning rang again in her ears. Trust no one. That night back at home, she spread the new documents across the table beside the diary. The kitchen lamp cast long shadows, the air thick with the smell of old paper. She sorted the pages, arranging them into neat stacks, her mind racing with the implications. The initials, the sums, the names, it was too much for her alone, too heavy to bear. And yet she knew she could tell no one. Not yet. Not until she understood more. A knock startled her from her thoughts. Sharp, sudden, against the door. She froze, every muscle taut. Another knock, softer this time, as though whoever stood outside had all the time in the world. Elizabeth crept to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to peer out. The porch was empty, the yard silent. Yet when she opened the door, the marks were there, muddy footprints pressed into the step, too large to be her own. Her throat tightened as she bolted the door once more. She gathered the papers swiftly, returning them to the hiding place beneath her bedroom floor. Lying in bed afterward, she stared into the dark, every nerve raw, her ears straining for the slightest sound. The night stretched long, heavy with silence, broken only by the sigh of the wind. But beneath that wind she thought she heard it again, the rhythm of footsteps on the porch, patient and circling. Sleep never came. She rose with dawn, her body weary, but her resolve sharpened. Fear gnawed at her, but anger burned beneath it. They wanted her afraid, wanted her to abandon the bridge, to bury the truth once more. She would not. The sheriff had been silenced, but she still had a voice. She packed the papers carefully that morning, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. The bridge had given her its secrets, and now others wanted them returned to the dark. But Elizabeth Hayes, widow and mock dreamer, would not yield. The game had shifted. No longer was she simply restoring a bridge. She was standing guard over its ghosts. The warning on her door and the soundless presence circling her house at night lingered with Elizabeth long after the footprints in the mud had faded. She had thought herself prepared for fear, thought she had learned to live with the unease that came with the bridge. But she had underestimated how much heavier dread became when it left the realm of imagination and stepped into her yard. The sheriff's diary had spoken of watching eyes and whispered threats, but now she felt them for herself. The old fear stretching into her life like a hand closing around her throat. Yet if the intention had been to drive her away, it had failed. The more the shadows pressed in, the more determined she became to press forward. Each morning she returned to the bridge, the bundle of papers tucked safely beneath her floorboards at home, the diary locked away with them. The patched section at the center span, the nails glinting too new among their rusted neighbors, called to her with growing insistence. She could not leave it untouched any longer. One gray morning, with the river swollen from recent rains, she carried a lantern and her tools to the span and set to work. Her hands shook as she pried at the boards, the sound of splintering wood loud as a gunshot in the still air. Beneath the first layer she found more boards, their nails driven in at clumsy angles, as though someone had sealed the space in haste. She worked slowly, sweat dampening her brow despite the chill, until at last the final board lifted free. The cavity gaped dark and foul beneath her. She lowered the lantern, its light casting flickering shadows into the hollow. For a long moment she saw nothing but damp earth and rotting timbers. Then the light caught on something pale and fragile. Her breath caught in her throat. Nestled among the debris lay a bundle of brittle photographs curled with age. She reached down with trembling fingers and lifted the first one. The image was black and white, blurred at the edges. But the scene was unmistakable. A group of men standing on the very bridge where she now knelt. Their expressions were grim, their clothes too fine for laborers, their eyes fixed on the camera, with a sharpness that seemed to pierce across the decades. One of the men bore a resemblance Elizabeth could not mistake. She had seen his portrait once in the county library, a politician who had risen quickly in the 1960s before vanishing from public record. She set the photograph aside and lifted another. This one showed a wagon on the bridge, its canvas cover pulled back to reveal dark shapes within. She leaned closer, her stomach twisting. They were people, their faces blurred but their forms unmistakable. Some sat with heads bowed, others stared straight ahead, their expressions vacant. Elizabeth's hand shook so violently she nearly dropped the picture. She pressed it against her chest, her eyes closing as she struggled to steady herself. The whispers of disappearances, the sheriff's frantic notes, they were no longer rumor. They were truth, captured in stark grain. She dug deeper into the cavity, pulling out more photographs, more letters. One letter, written in hurried script, spoke of deliveries made under cover of night, the orchard sealed, the garden not safe. Another spoke of bribes paid to ensure silence, of pressure from men in the city to keep the bridge open for as long as possible. The words were frantic, desperate, full of fear. She could almost hear the voice of the writer, hurried and trembling, as though scrawling the words before someone came to snatch the pen from his hand. Elizabeth sat back on the boards, the papers spread around her, the river roaring far below. She felt the world tilt, the ground of everything she had believed about her town shifting beneath her feet. The bridge had not simply been a site of corruption. It had been a channel through which lives had vanished. The people who disappeared had not wandered off, had not fallen victim to misfortune. They had been taken, used, discarded, and hidden beneath the silence of power. A sharp cry of gulls overhead pulled her back from the brink of collapse. She gathered the papers hastily, clutching them to her chest as though they might vanish if she let go. Her vision blurred with tears, her breath ragged, but her resolve only sharpened. To turn away now would be to allow the vanished to remain voiceless. She would not abandon them, not after seeing their faces. That evening, her daughter arrived unannounced, a suitcase in hand and worry etched across her face. The moment she saw Elizabeth's pale cheeks and trembling hands, her expression darkened. "Mom, what's happening here?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks." Elizabeth hesitated, the weight of silence pressing on her chest. She had sworn to herself not to speak, not to trust, but the words spilled out before she could stop them. She told her daughter about the metal box, the sheriff's diary, the letters and the photographs. She told her of the warning left on her door, of the footsteps circling her house at night. Her daughter's face grew pale as she listened, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. "This is insane," she whispered when Elizabeth finished. "You can't stay here. Whoever's behind this, Mom, they're dangerous. You have to leave before it's too late." But Elizabeth shook her head. "If I leave, the truth dies with me. That's what they want. They silenced the sheriff. They silenced those people. And now they want me gone too. But I can't. I won't." Her daughter pleaded, tears brimming in her eyes, but Elizabeth's resolve held. For years she had drifted aimlessly, her life hollowed by loss. Now, for the first time since Robert's death, she felt alive with purpose, even if that purpose was dangerous. She would not walk away. The night that followed was the longest of her life. They slept fitfully in the same room, her daughter curled on the couch, Elizabeth sitting upright in a chair by the window, the diary clutched in her lap. Twice she thought she heard footsteps outside, the deliberate crunch of boots on gravel. Once she saw a flicker of movement near the tree line, though when she strained to see, the darkness swallowed it whole. She did not rise, did not open the door. She sat in silence, the sheriff's warning a steady drumbeat in her mind. Trust no one. In the morning, when the first light crept across the fields, she found fresh marks near the porch scratches along the window frame, as though someone had tried to peer inside. Her daughter wept when she saw them, begging her to call the sheriff. But Elizabeth shook her head. The sheriff's office might be the last place she could turn. The diary had named them complicit once, and she could not be certain the corruption had vanished with time. To call for help might only hasten her silence. Instead, she returned to the bridge, her daughter reluctantly trailing behind. Together they pried further into the cavity beneath the boards, unearthing more than they had ever wished to find. A bundle wrapped in waxed cloth lay hidden beneath the rotten timbers. Inside were records of financial transactions, slips from banks, names of officials both local and distant. The amounts were staggering, far beyond the reach of ordinary farmers or traders. Her daughter read over her shoulder, her hands shaking. This is corruption at every level," she whispered. Elizabeth said nothing. She only stared at the figures, the names, the initials repeating again and again. The bridge had been a vein in a much larger body, pulsing with money and secrecy. And when the Whitfields, or whoever had lived near the bridge then, had stumbled too close to the truth, they had been erased. They carried the bundle back to the house, hiding it with the rest beneath the floorboards. The weight of the evidence pressed heavy on the air, filling the small rooms with a suffocating presence. Elizabeth tried to eat, tried to speak of ordinary things, but her mind could not let go of the faces in the photographs, of the ledger lines written in careful hand. The vanished were no longer nameless shadows. They were real, and they were waiting. That night, when the house lay quiet, Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table and spread the photographs before her. She traced the blurred faces with her fingertips, whispering apologies into the silence. She imagined their last moments, the confusion in their eyes, the betrayal that had carried them onto the bridge. Tears blurred her vision, but she did not look away. She could not. Her daughter entered quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Mom," she said softly, her voice breaking, "we can't do this alone. They'll come for us just like they came for him." Elizabeth looked up, her eyes red but steady. "Then let them come. I won't bury the truth again." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and unyielding. The bridge had demanded her silence, but she had chosen defiance. The vanished would not be forgotten, not if she could help it. And though fear pressed against her ribs, though shadows circled her house with patient steps, she felt something stronger than fear rising within her. The bridge had swallowed many, but it would not swallow her voice. The nights had become unbearable. Elizabeth lay awake in the dim hush of her bedroom, listening for every creak of the house, every restless sigh of the wind. Sleep no longer offered her refuge. When her eyes closed, the faces from the photographs appeared, hollow-eyed and silent, asking her why it had taken so long for someone to see them. Her daughter, exhausted and frightened, had stopped arguing and instead sat close by, as if her nearness alone might keep danger at bay. But nothing could banish the knowledge that the walls of their small world were closing in. Whoever had scrawled the message on her door, whoever had paced her porch under the cover of darkness, was waiting. And the longer she kept the papers hidden, the heavier the silence grew. By day, Elizabeth returned to the bridge, though her daughter begged her not to. She could not stay away. The bridge loomed like a wounded beast, its broken timbers creaking, its shadows long across the water. But it drew her with a pull she could not resist. She moved slowly across its span, her hands trailing the rough wood, listening for echoes in the boards beneath her feet. Each time she crossed, she felt the weight of all who had vanished before her. The river whispered below, patient and cold, carrying away secrets it had kept for half a century. On a pale morning in early spring, she stood in the middle of the bridge, the mist rising thick from the water, and felt the choice press upon her. She could hide the papers forever, let the bridge sink into ruin once more, and no one would ever know. It would be safer that way, for her daughter. Or she could carry the truth into the open, expose it to light after so many decades of shadow. But she knew the cost. To reveal what she had found meant to challenge not just memory, but the living descendants of men who had built fortunes upon silence. Some of them still walked the town, gray-haired and smiling, their reputations intact. Their children held positions of influence, their names engraved on the walls of banks and schools. To speak was to invite their wrath, yet to remain silent was to betray the vanished, and Elizabeth could not bear that weight. That afternoon, she packed the satchel with the sheriff's diary, the photographs, the ledgers, and the letters wrapped in waxed cloth. She carried them to the kitchen table and laid them out before her daughter. The young woman's eyes were red with sleeplessness, her face pale, but her voice was steady. If you show these, they'll come for us. If you hide them, they'll keep coming anyway. There's no safe path left, Mom. Only forward. Elizabeth felt tears burn her eyes as she reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. For years she had drifted, alone and untethered, her life dimmed by grief. Now sitting across from her daughter, she felt something she had thought gone forever, strength born not of defiance alone, but of love. If she could not build a future free of shadows for herself, she would do it for her child. The decision was made. 2 days later, she drove to a neighboring town, her satchel hidden beneath the seat of her car. She could not risk the local newspaper, not with the sheriff's warning still sharp in her mind. Instead, she sought out a small editor she remembered from her years at the library, a man who had once been brave enough to publish an exposé on corruption in the state capitol. She found him in a cramped office above a diner, his desk buried beneath stacks of papers. He looked up in surprise when she entered, then frowned at the sight of her trembling hands. She told him everything. Her voice shook at first, but as she unfolded the diary and photographs, as she laid the ledger pages before him, the words steadied. He listened in silence, his expression shifting from disbelief to horror to grim resolve. When she finished, he closed the diary gently and met her gaze. "If this is real," he said softly, "it will shake more than this county. It will stir ghosts that men have spent lifetimes trying to bury." "It is real," Elizabeth said, her voice low but unwavering, "and it's time someone spoke for the ones who never came home." He promised to verify what could be verified, to protect her name if she wished, but she shook her head. "No more hiding," she said. "If they want me silent, they'll have to try harder." Driving home, she felt lighter, though fear still pressed close. The burden was no longer hers alone. The truth was moving into the world, carried by ink and paper, soon to be read by eyes that had long turned away. That night, when headlights appeared at the end of her drive and lingered too long before vanishing, her heart pounded, but her spirit did not waver. Let them watch, she thought. Let them know. Within a week, the newspaper had printed the first story. Not the whole truth. There had not been time to verify every detail, but enough to ignite a fire. The headline spoke of hidden ledgers, of a sheriff's lost diary, of whispers of disappearances long dismissed as folklore. The photographs, blurred but unmistakable, stared out from the page. The bridge was named. Elizabeth was named. The effect was immediate. Reporters descended on her quiet road, their vans lining the lane, their questions sharp and insistent. Deputies appeared not long after, tape and flags in hand, their cameras flashing as they marked the places where she had dug beneath the boards, the cavity where the bundles had been hidden. The sheriff himself arrived one cold morning, his hat in hand, his face carefully unreadable. He walked the length of the bridge with her, his boots heavy on the planks, and asked in a low voice to see the place where the bones were said to lie. Elizabeth said nothing at first, but finally she led him to the garden beyond the orchard, to the patch of earth where the buried car had been unearthed. The deputies marked it with flags, their voices hushed, their eyes wary. The investigation widened quickly. More evidence surfaced, some from the bundles Elizabeth had unearthed, some from archives long forgotten. The names in the papers were traced, the initials matched to men once in power. Some were long dead, but their legacies lived on in buildings, in businesses, in the wealth of their heirs. The county, once content to let the bridge rot into obscurity, now found itself the center of a storm that spread across the state. For Elizabeth, the days blurred into interviews, questions, and the endless weight of attention. Yet in the quiet moments, when the reporters had gone and the deputies finished their work, she walked the bridge alone. She placed her hand on its rough railing and whispered into the rushing river below. "You are not forgotten," she said softly. "Not anymore." Her daughter, once desperate for her to leave, now stood beside her, her eyes fierce with pride. They spoke of restoring the orchard, of opening the farmstead once more, of turning the bridge into more than a monument to silence. They dreamed aloud of a place where the truth would be remembered, where the vanished would have their names spoken again. The night after the state confirmed the remains as Thomas Whitfield's, Elizabeth stood at the center span of the bridge, the lantern in her hand casting a small circle of light. The boards groaned beneath her feet. The water surged below, but she felt no fear. The bridge had once been a vault of secrets, a place where voices were swallowed. Now it was something else, a testament to survival, to the stubborn endurance of truth. She thought of Robert, of the dream that had led her here, and of the faces that had looked back at her from the photographs. For the first time in years, she felt not only grief, but peace. The vanished had their witness. Their silence had been broken. When she turned and walked back across the bridge, the mist lifted with the dawn, and the first light of morning touched the boards. It was not the end, she knew, but a beginning. The road ahead would be long, filled with battles and burdens she could hardly imagine. But she no longer walked it alone. Her daughter's steps echoed behind her, steady and certain, as they carried the truth out of the shadows and into the light. If this story kept you hooked, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next shocking twist. Check out our other unbelievable stories waiting for you right now. And share this video with your friends so they can discover the secret no one saw coming.